My mother-in-law arranged a dinner at an exclusive restaurant, but when I arrived, there was no seat reserved for me. She smirked. Maybe a budget place suits you better. I burst out laughing and asked the owner for a seat. Her smile vanished because the owner was my former line cook. I need to back up, not just to the dinner or even to the marriage. I need to back up to the beginning because none of what happened that night makes sense unless you understand where I came from and how long it took me to get there. My name is Athena Vasquez. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner in a part of the city that real estate listings still describe as up and coming. My mother worked the front counter at that dry cleaner for 19 years. My father left when I was 4. My grandmother lived 3 blocks away and made tamales on Sundays and told me that the world was full of people who would try to convince me my starting point was my ceiling. She was right about the first part. I started working at 16 because we needed the money. The job was washing dishes at a seafood restaurant called Miller's. Minimum wage, no air conditioning in the dish pit. Steam burns on both forearms by August. The head cook was a man named Sal Perselli, 62 years old, built like a retired boxer with hands that could break down a whole fish in the time it took most people to find a clean knife. He watched me for 3 weeks without saying a word. Then one evening after the dinner rush, he set a knife on the prep counter and slid it toward me. A good one. 8-inch chef's knife, chipped rosewood handle, blade thin from years of sharpening. You don't flinch, he said. That's half the job. Come in an hour early tomorrow. I came in an hour early every day for 4 months. He taught me to break down proteins without wasting anything. How a stock smells at each stage of reduction, knife cuts I didn't know had names, sauce work I didn't know had rules. He corrected me when I got something wrong and corrected me exactly once per mistake, which is the most efficient teaching method I've ever encountered. By the time I graduated high school, I could run a cold appetizer station on a Friday night without losing my composure. By 21, I had worked in 7 kitchens in 3 cities, learning the parts of the restaurant business that don't make it onto television. Vendor contracts, lease negotiations, health code compliance, labor law, the financial architecture of a hospitality operation, which is more complicated than most people imagine, and less forgiving than almost any other industry. At 23, I enrolled in a business program while working double shifts at a hotel restaurant. I wrote my first business plan on a legal pad in the break room. The concept was a development firm that specialized exclusively in hospitality, taking a concept from idea to operation, and then stepping back, handing the keys to the operator, moving to the next one. No one was doing exactly that. At 24, I filed the LLC paperwork with the last $4,000 in my savings account. Business address: my grandmother's kitchen table. The first 3 years were the kind of grinding that doesn't make a good story because it is simply relentless. Cold calling property owners, driving to undeveloped sites, sitting across from restaurateurs who looked at me, young, a woman, no family money, and decided in the first 30 seconds I wasn't worth their time. Losing those meetings, going back to my apartment, figuring out what I'd done wrong, going back out. The first real client was a bar owner in the warehouse district, 6 weeks from losing his lease and his concept. I restructured his supplier contracts over a weekend, rewrote the menu based on what the existing kitchen could execute, and renegotiated his lease at 20% below what he'd been paying. He was profitable in 4 months. He told 2 people. Those 2 told 2 more. That is how Keystone grew. Not through investors or press coverage, through results passed hand to hand. By 28, I had completed 11 projects and had a waiting list. I had a real office, a team, and a line of credit from the regional bank whose commercial lending officer had initially told me to come back when I had more experience. He was the one who called me. I also had Marco. Marco Reyes showed up at one of my project kitchens when he was 19, through a friend of a friend. His resume listed 1 job: sandwich counter associate at a gas station, 8 months. My sous chef, Carmen, looked at the resume and then at me with an expression that required no words. I gave him a trial week. That first week was, objectively, a disaster. He burnt the stock he'd been assigned to watch. He oversalted a batch of risotto base. He argued with my prep cook about how to brunoise an onion, and he was wrong. He was slow and stubborn and completely convinced he knew more than he did. Carmen pulled me aside on Wednesday. He's burning resources and lowering morale. I need him gone by Friday. That afternoon, I watched him alone at the prep station, redoing the burnt stock without being asked. He tasted it at each stage, eyes closed, working through whatever he was adjusting. When he finished, he tasted it again, and something in his face shifted. Not satisfaction, but the beginning of understanding. That instinct, the impulse to identify a failure and try again, without prompting, isn't teachable. Everything else in a kitchen is teachable. The drive to understand why something went wrong, and to keep going until it doesn't, that is either in someone or it isn't. Marco had it. I told Carmen to keep him. She was not pleased. I spent the next 3 years teaching him to actually cook, not to execute recipes, but to understand the underlying logic of flavor well enough to make real decisions in real time, under pressure, when 14 tickets are on the board and the recipe isn't working. That is the difference between a cook and a chef. He learned faster than anyone I had worked with since my own time under Sal. When I opened my second project location, I made him lead line. He was 22. When he told me 2 years later that he wanted his own place, I co-signed his first commercial lease because no bank was going to touch a 26-year-old with a gas station on his resume. That was 11 years ago. Now Marco runs Crestwood. 3-month waitlist. Quick fix at $280 a head. Food and Wine profiled him last spring. The headline called him self-made. I never corrected it. Marco tried to. I told him not to bother. My mother-in-law had no idea about any of this. She had never bothered to ask. Daniel Marsh was 31 when I met him, managing a bar called The Wicklow that was losing $4,000 a month and didn't know it yet. I had been hired by the property owner to assess whether the concept was salvageable. I spent 3 days going through the financials before I ever spoke to Daniel. By the time I sat down across from him, I had a complete picture of what was wrong. He had a complete picture of how to make a person feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was handsome in the way of a man who has been told so often enough to have built his personality around it. Dark hair, good jaw, the easy confidence that reads, at first, as competence. He shook my hand and held it a fraction too long and said, "I've heard you can fix anything." I fixed the Wicklow in 3 months. New suppliers, new menu, renegotiated lease, restructured staffing. The turnaround got industry press. Daniel was photographed for a local business magazine in front of the bar he had not meaningfully saved. I noticed. I did not say anything. At the time, I told myself that press attribution in the hospitality industry is imprecise and that what mattered was the result. We were married 14 months after we met. Looking back, I can identify the exact moment I made the decision that would define the next 6 years. A dinner party, early in our relationship. Daniel was at the center of the room, working it the way he worked every room, with an ease I have never had and have spent years making peace with. A commercial real estate developer came to me and said, "Your partner has great instincts for this business." I smiled and said, "He really does." I don't know why I said it. It was the easiest thing to say. It didn't feel like a lie at the time. It felt like letting a small thing go rather than making a scene. But small lies have the same property as small structural compromises in a building. They don't stay small. They distribute the load to the wrong places, and over time, the places bearing that load begin to bend. By the time I brought Daniel into Keystone, managing partner, 10% equity, salary, and operating agreement Francis drafted with precision, the narrative had calcified into something I no longer knew how to interrupt without blowing up a structure. Everyone in our professional circle believed Daniel ran the company. He had become, through accretion and omission and 100 moments where I had not corrected the record, the face of something I had built from nothing. I had let it happen, not naively. I was never naive about it, but deliberately, for reasons that felt like pragmatic compromises. The real reason, which I couldn't fully articulate until I was in Francis's office 6 weeks before the dinner, was simpler. I loved him. Not the gasping love of early infatuation, but the steadier kind that comes from knowing someone's specific weaknesses and choosing them anyway. I knew Daniel was not built for the invisible work. I had made a decision to protect him from the parts of Keystone that would have exposed that gap. I thought I was being generous. I was building a fiction elaborate enough to eventually require its own defense. The Marsh family were, in my grandmother's language, people with pretensions. Not old money. Old money rarely has to perform the way the Marshes performed. Daniel's father, Gerald, had run a development firm 25 years ago, had a name that opened doors, a house in the right neighborhood. His firm collapsed when Daniel was 15. Gerald drank himself out of the picture and died when Daniel was 20. The obituary was brief. What remained was Renata. Renata did not grieve in any way visible to the outside world. She reconstructed instead. The right club memberships, the right luncheon committees, the right vocabulary, selective instead of cheap, intimate instead of small. She cultivated over 15 years the impression that the Marshes had simply evolved beyond their previous circumstances. She was very good at this. Good enough that I believe there were people in her social circle who did not know, after a decade of knowing her, that she was living on a modest investment account, rental income, and the distributions that Keystone paid Daniel. She decided, on the night Daniel first brought me to Sunday dinner, that I was a problem. The assessment was quick. She asked where I'd gone to school. Community college, I said. Oh, how practical. She asked if my family was from the city originally. My grandmother still lives 3 blocks from where I grew up, I said. How nice to have roots. Filed and dismissed. Her hostility was strategic rather than overt. The Marsh family seat at the short end of the table, the cropped family photos, the introductions to her garden club friends as Daniel's partner in the business. Every slight was calibrated. Every exclusion deniable. She never raised her voice. She simply rearranged the room until I was standing outside it, and then she looked surprised to find me there. The worst instance was her 62nd birthday. A photographer arrived for the family portrait. Renata arranged herself in front of the fireplace with Daniel and Claudia's husband Brett. I stood to join them. Renata held up one hand and turned to the photographer without looking at me. 6 frames. I went back to my chair and helped clear the appetizer plates because it was something to do with my hands. That night, driving home, Daniel said, "She just gets caught up in the moment. You know how she is with photos. She didn't mean anything by it." That sentence was a load-bearing wall in our marriage. It held up the ceiling by absorbing the weight of every small, deniable cruelty Renata committed and distributing it onto a single claim that absolved everyone. She didn't mean anything by it. He said it so many times I think he had actually trained himself to believe it, because believing it was easier than the alternative, that his mother was doing it on purpose and he was choosing to let her. I stopped arguing with the sentence about 2 years in. Not because I'd accepted it, because I had understood that it was a faith claim, and you can't argue someone out of faith. What you can do is wait. The group chat appeared on my phone screen on a Tuesday night 3 weeks before the dinner. I was in the kitchen getting water. Daniel was asleep upstairs. His phone was on the counter, face up, unlocked. A notification sliding across the screen from a group labeled Marsh Family that cut off mid-sentence with my name at the edge of the preview. I am not a person who reads things she isn't supposed to read. My professional life involves constant intake of confidential information, financials, contracts, communications that belong to clients and partners, and I handle that information with exactly the discretion it requires. But it was 11:30 at night, and my name was at the edge of that screen, and I had 6 years of small accumulated evidence pointing me toward whatever was in it. I picked up the phone. 47 messages, spanning 3 weeks. I read everyone. The first thread was logistics. Renata organizing the dinner, venue confirmed, menu pre-selected, guest list finalized, every name listed. Daniel, Claudia, Brett, Garden Club friends, cousins, a mid-level Halloran contact, and Patricia Engel, VP of Development at Halloran, confirmed. Ensure she is seated near Daniel. Patricia Engel. I had spent 11 months cultivating Patricia Engel at Halloran Hotel Group, flown to their headquarters twice, pitched the flagship concept, 200-seat restaurant, rooftop bar, $4 million build-out, the largest contract Keystone had ever been close to. I had built every piece of the pitch, the concept deck, the pro forma, the staffing model, the sourcing strategy, the revenue projections. Daniel had attended one meeting and sent one follow-up email from his phone. Patricia Engel had confirmed dinner with Daniel. I kept reading. 12 messages down, the thread shifted. Renata, we need to talk about the company. The arrangement is not sustainable. Daniel needs to be the clear principal going forward. Athena's role should be advisory. Claudia, Brett could handle the operational side. He needs something structured. Renata, exactly. Daniel manages client relationships. Brett handles operations. Athena consults. Quietly. Claudia, does she have some kind of ownership stake? Daniel mentioned something. Renata, Daniel says it's mostly his. She helped build it, but the equity structure was always meant to be rebalanced as the company grew. She helped build it. I read that 3 times. The company I had conceived, funded, built from a legal pad business plan, run through 11 years of 7-day weeks. She helped build it. I scrolled down. Daniel's contributions to 47 messages, 3 thumbs up emojis, 1 sounds good mom, and a single sentence. I'll talk to Athena about stepping back from the client-facing stuff. She's always preferred the operational side anyway. I put the phone back on the counter, face down, exactly where I had found it. The refrigerator hummed. The faucet dripped in the rhythm it had been dripping in for 6 months, despite my having mentioned it to Daniel 4 times. I went upstairs, opened my laptop, and sent Francis Doyle a 2-line email. I need to move on the operating agreement. When can you meet this week? Francis met me the next morning. I brought coffee and the navy folder. Soft leather, midnight blue, Keystone's logo embossed on the corner. I had carried that folder to every significant meeting in Keystone's history. It had become, over the years, a talisman, evidence that the thing was real. She read the group chat photographs and set her reading glasses down. He's been misrepresenting his interest, she said, to his family, to clients, presumably to Halloran, to everyone, I said, the whole time. She was quiet. Then, what do you want to happen? I told her. The dinner, the removal notice, the divorce filing, the asset separation. I had been thinking since 11:30 the night before, and by 9 in the morning it was a plan, not a reaction. Francis listened. Then, the removal clause is clean. Majority member initiates, 60 days without cause, 30 with. You're at 70%. There's no contest. What about the Halloran relationship? Patricia Engel has met with you twice. The LOI is addressed to Keystone. She knows who built the concept. She needs to be in a room where she can observe who the principal actually is. That was how we decided on the dinner. I want to be specific about that decision, because I think it's sometimes misunderstood. I did not go to Crestwood to humiliate Renata or punish Daniel. I went because the invitation addressed my household. Patricia Engel would be there, and she was about to close a contract on a relationship I had built. That relationship needed to be correctly attributed before the papers were signed. The humiliation was not something I engineered. It was something the Marshes had built over 6 years of careful construction, and what they built could only stand as long as no one examined the foundation. I walked in. The foundation became visible. That's all. In the days before the dinner, Renata called to say the table was intimate and fully set, and she hoped I would understand. I said, of course, I'll be there at 7. Claudia called to say the seating was selective. I asked, is there a seat for me, Claudia? She said, I'm sure Daniel will sort it out. He's so good at that. Daniel texted 40 minutes after I texted him that he would handle it. He did not handle it. I called Crestwood directly. 14 guests in the Marsh party. My name, not among them. I did not ask them to add me. I called Marco. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I'd heard the reservation was there. He said, yeah, I didn't realize you weren't in the party. I've been meaning to reach you. I said, I'm not in the party, but I'll be there. He was quiet. Then, I'll have the counter ready. I said, don't do anything ahead of time. Let it happen the way it happens. He said, are you sure? I said, I've been sure for 11 years. Trust me one more time. He said, always. Chef? Yeah, they don't know, do they? What you built. They're about to find out. The morning of the dinner, I had the key documents notarized at Francis's office. Drove home, got dressed. Black dress, low heels, small earrings. Nothing that announced itself. On the shelf above my desk, Sal's knife sat in its canvas roll. I looked at it for a moment. I left it there. What I needed was already in the navy folder. I locked the door and drove to Crestwood. Crestwood occupied the ground floor of a converted textile warehouse on the east side of downtown, in a block that had been industrial and then empty and then contested by developers for a decade before Marco got there first. He had seen something in the building that others hadn't. The ceiling height, the way the late afternoon light came through the clear story windows. The build-out had taken 8 months and most of his savings. He had designed the interior himself with an architect friend, and the result looked effortless because every decision in it had been made by someone who understood both aesthetics and function. Exposed brick and iron beams, the original wide plank floors refinished rather than replaced, candlelight turning everything amber in the evening, the open kitchen visible through a long pass of polished steel that Marco had insisted on over the architect's objections. I want the guests to see the food being made, he said. That's the most dramatic thing there is. He was right. He usually is, about the things that matter in a kitchen. The taxi let me out at 6:58. I had calculated the timing deliberately. exactly. Not early enough to hover, not late enough to create theater. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusted my bag, and went inside. The hostess, early 20s, the composed efficiency of someone trained by someone who takes service seriously, asked my name. I gave it. She scanned her list twice. Marsh party? I said, her expression neutralized into professional, careful. Right this way. The party was at a long table beneath the original ceiling beams, lit by a chandelier Marco had salvaged from a theater demolition. 14 places, set with specificity. Copper ink cards on cream stock, candles at precise intervals, flowers in low arrangements that didn't block sightlines. I walked its length and read each card. My name was not on any of them. Everyone was seated. Daniel at Renata's right, Claudia and Brett across from him, garden club friends, cousins, Tom Vickers from Halloran, 14 people celebrating a company I had built, at a dinner I had not been invited to. Renata sat at the head with her hands folded and her smile in the configuration she used when she had prepared something to say. She was not surprised to see me standing there without a seat. That was the design. She said, "Oh, sweetheart, maybe a budget place suits you better." The garden club women smiled. A cousin laughed. Brett looked at his bread plate. Daniel looked at his fork. I laughed too, genuinely, because I had just spotted something Renata hadn't. I turned to the nearest server and asked if Marco was in. He straightened. That specific adjustment that happens when someone says a name that carries weight in a room. Tell him Athena's here. He went to the kitchen. I turned back to the table. 14 faces. Renata's smile still in place, but something behind it shifting. She had not planned for this variable. 50 seconds later, the kitchen door opened. Marco came out in his chef's coat, already wiping his hands on a side towel. And the moment he saw me, his whole face changed. He crossed the dining room in 4 strides and grabbed both my hands. "Chef, I've been trying to reach you all week. Not Athena. Not ma'am. Not the unnamed guest on an ivory card. Chef." He turned to the hostess without letting go. "Set up the counter. Right now, please." The chef's counter at Crestwood was 6 seats facing directly into the open kitchen. Not on the booking system, no listed price, no public availability. Marco offered it occasionally to specific guests, for reasons that were entirely his. A reservation platform had ranked it the most in-demand seat in the city based on inquiry volume versus availability. He pulled out the center seat himself and placed a fresh card on the marble. My name, copper ink, cream stock. Renata had gone completely still. Daniel had turned in his chair with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not confusion exactly. The expression of a person recognizing that the story they've been telling doesn't match what's written underneath it. Marco leaned against the past, talking the way he always has, like the room contracts to contain only the 2 of us. They seated the whole party without checking if you were coming. I would have called but figured you knew. He glanced at the long table, at Renata specifically. "You didn't tell them who she is?" She said nothing. Marco looked back at me. "This is the woman who gave me my first real kitchen. I wouldn't have a lease, a menu, or this room without her. I tell every cook who comes to work here, loud enough for all 14 to hear." Renata set her water glass down without drinking from it. Daniel turned back to the table and put both hands flat on the cloth. Patricia Engel arrived while Marco and I were talking. I heard her name at the host stand and saw her crossing the room in my peripheral vision, still in her coat. She stopped at the chef's counter. "Athena Vasquez." Not a question. "Patricia Engel," I said. She pulled up a stool and sat. She said, "I want to ask something directly." I said, "Please." She said, "The rooftop concept, the vertical garden sourcing model, the 40-month revenue projection broken into quarterly staffing phases. That was your work." I said, "Yes." "All of it?" I built the entire pitch. Daniel was in the introductory meeting. She nodded. The nod of someone confirming what they had already suspected. She said, "In January, he couldn't explain the revenue model. I asked him 3 questions about the quarterly projections, and each time he gave me a restatement of the previous slide rather than an actual answer. I assumed he was deferring on detail. I didn't realize the detail wasn't his." I said nothing. There was nothing to add. She said, "I'll have my office reissue the letter of intent Monday. Addressed correctly this time." She did not say to you. She didn't need to. She stood, patted the counter once, looked once at Daniel with the neutral assessment of a person recalibrating a relationship, and walked back toward the bar. The table had been quiet since Marco spoke. Now it was quieter. The garden club women were leaning toward each other with the bright particular interest of people who have just been handed very good material. Brett had pushed his chair back slightly, the posture of a man preparing to exit a building that is on fire. Claudia was gripping the edge of her napkin. Tom Vickers from Halloran was on his phone, but his head was angled toward the chef's counter. Daniel turned in his chair to look at me again. I looked back at him, not with anger, not with triumph, with the bone-deep calm of a woman who had stopped covering for a lie she had never told. I reached into my bag and set the navy folder on the marble counter. I unzipped it and pulled out the operating agreement, open to Article 3. "Daniel," I said, "I'm going to read something." He didn't answer. I wasn't asking permission. "Keystone Hospitality Group, LLC. Membership interest. Athena K. Vasquez, 70%. Daniel R. Marsh, 10%. Hargrove Capital Partners, 20%. I looked up. Every face at the long table was directed at me. "You signed this 9 years ago," I said. "You signed the annual acknowledgement every year since. Your 10% entitles you to a salary and a distribution schedule. It does not entitle you to the company." Renata stood up. Her chair made a sound like a gunshot on the hardwood. She said, "Daniel built that company." Renata. I turned to her. "You are welcome to read the document yourself. Page 4, paragraph 2. The founding member is listed by name." I put the agreement flat on the counter. 9 years of signatures. 9 years of capital contributions. Mine. 9 years of a man who had never read the paperwork, signing his name at the bottom of a page that that said, plainly, that his wife owned the company he told everyone was his. Renata's voice cracked. After everything this family gave you, we took you in. We gave you a name. You were nobody, Athena. Daniel gave you a life. I said. Daniel gave me a business card. I gave him the business. Daniel stood up. He looked at Renata. His voice came out rougher than I'd expected, like something had broken loose on the way up. Mom. She built all of it. The room held its breath. Renata looked at her son with an expression I had never seen her wear. Something unperformed, uncalibrated, real. Fear. The specific fear of a woman who has maintained a performance long enough to forget there was ever anything else. Now watching the curtain move. Daniel looked at me. He said, I'm sorry. I don't know if that's worth anything at this point. I said, it's worth something. It's not enough to change anything. He nodded. He sat down. He put both hands flat on the tablecloth and was quiet. The quiet of a man who has finally run out of the energy required to maintain a false position. The table began to empty in the slow, orderly way that tables empty when the event is over, and everyone needs a moment to reassemble themselves before standing. The cousins signed first. The Garden Club women stayed for dessert and spoke to each other in low voices with the focused energy of people cataloging. Tom Vickers left without looking at the long table again. Claudia pulled her coat on and looked at me across the room. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the documents on the counter hadn't already said. Brett followed her to the door. He had not spoken a single word for the last 40 minutes of the dinner. Renata was the last to leave. She stood from her chair with the particular effort of a woman whose performance had been running for so long that without it she didn't entirely know how to hold herself upright. She walked past the chef's counter without looking at me, past the host stand, and out through the front door. Daniel followed her. He stopped in the doorway and turned back once. He looked at me at the chef's counter with Marco's fresh card in front of me and the navy folder closed beside it, and he said quietly, so that it probably wasn't audible to anyone else, I always knew it was yours. I should have said so. I said, yes, you should have. He turned and went out. The door swung closed. The dining room returned to its normal pitch. Other diners who had gone somewhat quieter during the preceding hour resumed their conversations. The kitchen behind the pass continued to move with the steady, specific rhythm of a service in full stride. Marco came out 10 minutes later and sat across from me at the counter. He brought the second course himself, a roasted beet composition with house-made ricotta and a vinaigrette built around reduced beet greens, clean, precise, the kind of dish that looks simple until you try to make it. He said, you okay? I said, genuinely okay. I've been okay since about 11:30 on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago. He said, that's specific. I said, that's specific. He set his notebook on the counter and picked up his pen. He said, the sous chef, Dara. You said to put her name on the menu. I said, a section that's entirely hers. Let her design it. Her name in print. He wrote it down. Same notebook, same habit, same instinct to capture the thing before it slips. We ate and talked for an hour. The spring menu, the second location he was evaluating, Dara's development. The long table was entirely clear by 9 o'clock, swept and reset and indistinguishable from what it had been before the Marsh party arrived. At 9:15, I folded my napkin, put the navy folder back in my bag, and stood up. Marco came around the counter. He hugged me the way he had the night Crestwood got its first major review. In the alley behind the restaurant at 2 in the morning, still smelling like service. He held on the same way. He said into my shoulder, thank you for all of it, every single piece of it. I said, give Dara the menu project, her name on it. He pulled back and looked at me. He said, done. I walked out through the main dining room, past tables of people having the kind of evening Crestwood was designed for, through the front door and into the night. May in this city is jasmine season. The smell was everywhere, sweet, slightly heavy, the kind that attaches to specific evenings and makes them retrievable years later. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. I did not need to stay and watch the aftermath. I had the documents. Francis had the filing. Patricia Engel had the corrected letter of intent. The foundation was solid. It had been solid the whole time. I called a car and waited in the jasmine-scented dark with my bag on my shoulder, the navy folder inside it, and the weight of the thing I had been carrying for 6 years finally, completely set down. Monday went the way Mondays go when you've spent the weekend preparing. Francis filed the managing partner removal notice at 9 in the morning under Article 7 of the operating agreement. By noon, Daniel's access to Keystone's accounts, email, and project management systems had been suspended. By 3, his corporate card was deactivated. He called twice. I didn't answer. He texted at 4:17, can we please talk? I texted back, our attorneys will be in contact. His lawyer, retained over the weekend, attempted to contest the removal on the grounds that the equity structure had been verbally amended throughout the marriage. Francis conveyed this to me with the particular dryness she reserves for arguments she finds professionally offensive, and responded that verbal amendments to an LLC operating agreement are not recognized under state law, and that 9 consecutive years of signed acknowledgments indicating no structural changes would present something of an obstacle to that claim. The attorney said he would be in touch. Francis said she looked forward to it. The divorce filing went through Wednesday. Asset separation was leaner than most, because Francis had structured the operating agreement specifically to wall off company assets from marital property. The house, the cars, the joint accounts, subject to division. Keystone, not. Daniel's 10% equity stake was frozen pending independent appraisal. He kept the house. It seemed appropriate. It was the house his family had chosen, in the neighborhood they preferred, on the street where the neighbors knew the name Marsh. I had never loved it. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment 4 blocks from Crestwood, in a neighborhood that real estate listings were beginning to call up and coming. I chose it deliberately. The Halloran contract signed 3 weeks later. Patricia Engel's office reissued the letter of intent as promised. The final contract, 200-seat flagship, rooftop bar, $4.2 $2 million build-out, 5-year management agreement with renewal options. My name on every page. Claudia called once, about 10 days after the dinner. She said, "You didn't have to do it that way. You could have come to us privately." I said, "Claudia, I sat at the short end of your family's table for 6 years and watched your mother photograph the family without me in the frame. I gave you 11 years of private. Private didn't work." She was quiet. Then, "Brett needed that opportunity." I said, "Brett needs something he's qualified for." I hung up. I felt bad about the Brett comment for about a day. Then I remembered that Claudia had been in the group chat agreeing that I could consult quietly in the company I had built. The feeling passed. Renata did not call. A mutual acquaintance reported that she had told the garden club I had orchestrated the evening and that she had been blindsided by someone who had misrepresented herself throughout the marriage. The garden club women who had watched Patricia Engel confirm the authorship of the Halloran pitch and Marco confirm 11 years of professional history were apparently skeptical. The acquaintance said, "I don't think it's landing the way Renata hopes." I said, "It rarely does when the witnesses are already in the room." Daniel and I did not speak for several months. When we did, a brief functional call about the final asset documentation, he was careful and said nothing not directly relevant to the paperwork. He sounded like a person who had been thinking hard and hadn't yet finished. At the end of the call, he said, "For what it's worth, I always knew it was your company." I told myself it didn't matter because we were building it together. I said, "We weren't building it together. I was building it. You were representing it. Those are different jobs." He said, "I know that now." I said, "I think you knew it then too. I think you just didn't want to live in what that meant." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, you're right," he said. "I hope the Halloran project goes well." I said, "It will." It did. Marco texted 6 weeks after the dinner. A photo of the new spring menu with a section at the bottom labeled "From the sous chef's garden." 6 dishes, each with a small D in script. Dara's section, her name on the menu. Below the photo, he had written, "You were right." Below that, "You're always right." Below that, "Don't tell her I said that or she'll start thinking she can run the place." I wrote back, "She should run the place. Start planning for it." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. He wrote, "I know. That's what scares me." I wrote, "Good. That's exactly the right feeling to have about the right person." The Halloran project broke ground 4 months after the dinner. I was on site the morning they poured the foundation, in a hard hat and steel-toed boots with a coffee and the architect's drawings, watching the concrete find its level. I had done this before, stood at the beginning of something before it looked like anything, when it was just bones and math and people who could see what it was going to be. This one was different. The others I had built quietly, out of habit, because I had told myself the work should speak for itself and that requiring acknowledgement was a weakness. I had hidden myself inside my own company and been surprised when other people moved into the space I left empty. I was not going to do that again. The architect came over and handed me a revised drawing. She said, "I made the changes you asked for on the garden section. It's better now." I looked at it. It was significantly better. I said, "This is good. Put my notes in the revision history so the contractor can see the reasoning." She made the note and went back to her table. I stood with the drawing and looked at the concrete finding its level, gray and smooth, and not yet anything except the solid ground that everything else would be built on. Sal's knife is still on the shelf above my desk. Canvas roll, rubber band, the chipped rosewood handle, the blade thin from 40 years of sharpening. He sharpened it so many times, returning it to what it was supposed to be, that he removed everything from it that wasn't essential. That's what happens when you keep working something back to its actual form. It gets lighter. It holds an edge longer. It becomes, eventually, the most useful version of itself. I have started from nothing twice. Once at 16 with a dish it and a knife I hadn't earned yet. Once at 37 with an operating agreement and a Navy folder and a former line cook who had never stopped telling every cook he trained exactly who had given him his first real kitchen. Both times the foundation held. The concrete has been curing for 4 months now. In 6 weeks the steelwork starts. Ciao. In 14 months the first service will go out through a pass that doesn't exist yet, prepared by a team that hasn't been fully hired, in a room that is currently a shell with clear story windows and a ceiling height that Marco, when I brought him for a site visit last month, stood in the middle of and said, yeah, this is right." He said, "You're going to put your name on this one." I said, "I put my name on all of them." He said, "You know what I mean. Not just in the documents. On the door." I thought about it. The door that would eventually be a door in the shell that would eventually be a restaurant, in a building that was still mostly math and concrete and possibility. I said, "Yeah, on the door." He smiled. He said, "Good. The room is finally catching up. It took a while, but the foundation held the whole time."